Diplomatic envoy Thomas Mitchell reviewed his cultural briefings for the third time as the transport shuttle approached Serenity Prime, trying to memorize protocol guidelines that could prevent innocent human comments from triggering interspecies incidents during the most important peace negotiations in the history of human-Etherian relations. Remember, Ambassador Chen had emphasized during the final briefing on Earth, the Etherians encode emotional and social meanings into verbal expressions in ways that can create binding legal obligations if the wrong words are used in the wrong context. Your job is to facilitate communication while ensuring that our negotiators don't accidentally propose marriage, declare war, or activate ancient cultural mechanisms that we don't understand. Facilitate without creating diplomatic disasters. Understood, Thomas had replied, though privately he wondered whether successful diplomacy between species required the kind of linguistic precision that made every conversation feel like navigating a minefield of potential misunderstandings. The Crystal Reaches Palace on Serenity Prime represented neutral ground between human and Etherian territories. Its impossible architecture, designed by neither species, but by the consortium of independent worlds to accommodate both civilizations' needs, while avoiding aesthetic choices that might suggest favoritism toward either side. The result was a structure that combined crystalline beauty with functional efficiency, providing conference chambers and diplomatic quarters that prioritized successful negotiation over architectural elegance. Thomas's role during the peace talks was carefully defined. Monitor interactions between delegations for potential cultural missteps, provide real-time guidance when human representatives approached sensitive topics, and ensure that diplomatic personnel understood the difference between routine conversation and potentially binding cultural commitments that could invalidate years of careful preparation. The Etherians practice something called resonance bonding. Dr. Sarah Kim, the xenocultural specialist, had explained during his preparation training. Certain verbal expressions of sincere emotion or personal appreciation can activate ancient laws that create permanent connections between individuals. Any suggestion that negotiations are being influenced by personal relationships rather than objective policy evaluation could provide justification for abandoning whatever agreements might be reached. What kind of personal relationships? Any kind that involves authentic emotional expression rather than diplomatic courtesy. The Etherians don't distinguish between professional admiration and romantic attraction when evaluating the sincerity of verbal appreciation. Dr. Kim's expression had been serious enough to suggest that Thomas's understanding of this distinction was crucial to mission success. They believe that lasting peace requires genuine emotional investment, but they also recognize that such investment can compromise the neutrality necessary for fair negotiation. Thomas had spent the journey to Serenity Prime studying Etherian communication protocols, trying to understand the complex balance between emotional authenticity and diplomatic objectivity that would be required for successful facilitation of negotiations that represented both species' best hope for avoiding a war that could consume entire star systems. The negotiations themselves took place in the palace's Grand Assembly Chamber, where Princess Arya Lumthara presided over the Etherian delegation with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding submission. The Etherians looked almost human, except for the pointed ears and the luminous skin markings that shifted patterns based on emotional states that Thomas's briefings described as culturally significant social communication requiring careful interpretation. The territorial boundaries proposed in Section 7 require clarification regarding enforcement mechanisms and dispute resolution procedures. Princess Arya observed during the second day's sessions, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that characterized diplomatic discourse, while her luminous markings shifted through patterns that Thomas was learning to interpret as thoughtful analysis rather than emotional reaction. We're prepared to provide additional detail about administrative oversight and compliance verification," replied Ambassador Chen, though Thomas noted that the response avoided addressing the specific concerns Princess Arya had raised about practical implementation of boundary agreements that would need to function effectively despite political pressure from factions who opposed any form of cooperation. Thomas found himself increasingly impressed by Princess Arya's approach to the negotiations. Her questions demonstrated comprehensive understanding of both the technical details and broader implications of proposed agreements, while her suggestions often identified creative solutions that served both species' interests more effectively than the competitive alternatives that dominated most diplomatic discussions. The problem was that his professional admiration for Princess Arya's intelligence and dedication was becoming complicated by personal attraction that he was certain would compromise his ability to provide neutral facilitation if other negotiators became aware of feelings that went beyond appropriate diplomatic appreciation. "Princess Arya has been asking about your background and perspectives on human cultural communication patterns," Dr. Kim mentioned during one of their evening briefings. "She seems particularly interested in your opinions about the relationship between emotional expression and institutional policy development. I hope you emphasize that my role is neutral facilitation rather than policy advocacy," Thomas replied, though he was aware that his responses to Princess Arya's questions had probably revealed more about his personal views than strict professional objectivity would recommend. "I emphasized appropriate protocol boundaries, yes, though I should mention that Princess Arya's interest in your perspectives appears to be based on intellectual curiosity about cultural integration rather than personal attraction, if that distinction affects your approach to future interactions." Thomas wasn't entirely certain that the distinction was as clear as Dr. Kim suggested, or that his own reactions to Princess Arya's attention were based purely on professional appreciation for her diplomatic skills. The growing awareness that he was beginning to care more about the success of her negotiating objectives than his assignment as neutral facilitator required suggested it was necessary to maintain greater emotional distance from all participants, especially from Princess Arya, whose combination of intelligence, dedication, and underlying compassion made every interaction feel more personally significant than diplomatic protocol should allow. His solution was careful professional courtesy, acknowledging Princess Arya's authority and insights while avoiding the deeper conversations about cultural philosophy and emotional expression that had characterized their earlier interactions. The approach preserved appropriate boundaries while preventing personal feelings from influencing his professional judgment about facilitating negotiations that could determine the future of both civilizations. But as the peace talks continued, and Thomas maintained his strategy of respectful distance, he began to sense that Princess Arya was interpreting his careful neutrality as evidence of either diminished interest in her perspectives or institutional discomfort with Etherian approaches to diplomatic problem-solving, creating misunderstandings that could affect her confidence in human commitment to genuine cooperation rather than strategic positioning disguised as diplomatic engagement. He had no way of knowing that Princess Arya's evaluation of his professional competence and personal character had led her to conclusions about the potential for authentic partnership between their species, or that her growing appreciation for his integrity and intelligence was making his careful distance increasingly difficult to interpret as appropriate diplomatic protocol, rather than personal rejection of possibilities that she had begun to hope might transcend the political boundaries that separated their peoples. But as Thomas continued his work facilitating communication while maintaining appropriate emotional detachment, he began to understand that his attempts to preserve neutrality were creating complications that might prove more damaging to the peace process than the personal feelings he was trying to conceal. The fourth day of negotiations revealed subtle tensions that Thomas's diplomatic training helped him recognize, but didn't provide clear guidance for resolving. During discussions of joint resource management in the contested Vega system, certain advisors from both delegations seemed more concerned about limiting Princess Arya's access to specific information than about achieving comprehensive resolution of territorial disputes. The mineral survey data from the outer planets appears to have significant discrepancies, Princess Arya observed during her review of the proposed economic cooperation framework. Several key assessments that were referenced in preliminary reports are missing from the documentation provided to these negotiations. Thomas noted that the comment triggered urgent whispered consultations among both human and Etherian officials, while Princess Arya's luminous markings shifted to patterns that suggested increased attention rather than routine information processing. Documentation gaps are unfortunately common in complex territorial analyses spanning multiple survey periods, replied General Morrison from the human military delegation, his tone carrying diplomatic courtesy that didn't quite conceal evasive intent. I'm confident that any missing materials can be located in appropriate archives if their inclusion becomes essential for comprehensive evaluation. The exchange was procedurally correct and diplomatically appropriate, but Thomas's experience with negotiation dynamics flagged it as the kind of careful non-response that usually indicated participants were avoiding discussions they preferred not to have. Princess Arya's growing awareness that information was being deliberately withheld created tension that affected her interactions with all human representatives. Though Thomas noticed that her evaluation of his role as cultural facilitator seemed based on assessment of his character, rather than suspicion about institutional coordination in whatever information management was limiting her access to complete documentation. During the evening break, Thomas found himself in the palace's observation garden, reviewing communication protocols while trying to determine whether Princess Arya's apparent trust in his professional integrity created opportunities for clarifying misunderstandings or additional complications that could undermine his neutral facilitation role. The linguistic challenges of interspecies diplomacy are more complex than most people realize, Princess Arya observed, approaching with the kind of purposeful casualness that suggested she was prepared for substantive conversation rather than diplomatic ceremony. Cultural Liaison Officer Mitchell, she said, employing formal courtesy while her expression suggested readiness for the kind of personal discussion that diplomatic protocols typically discouraged. I hope you don't mind my interrupting your evening review. Not at all, Your Highness. Though I should mention that if there are concerns about communication protocols or cultural interpretation, those might be better addressed through formal diplomatic channels. This isn't about formal protocols, Princess Arya replied, settling onto a crystalline bench that seemed to grow from the garden's living light fixtures. This is about whether the human delegation's apparent commitment to peaceful resolution reflects genuine policy changes or diplomatic theater designed to gain strategic advantages through temporary agreements. Thomas joined her on the bench, noting that the garden's ambient systems were responding to their presence by creating privacy fields that would prevent their conversation from being monitored by surveillance equipment from either delegation. Speaking as someone whose job involves monitoring human diplomatic communication for cultural accuracy, I can say that the commitment to peace appears genuine at the working level, Thomas replied carefully. The question is whether the people making ultimate policy decisions share that commitment or view these negotiations as political positioning that serves domestic audiences while buying time for other strategic preparations. Political positioning to accomplish what objectives? Demonstrating good faith to constituent populations while maintaining flexibility for military options if the diplomatic approach proves insufficient to secure territorial and resource objectives. Thomas said, though he immediately wondered whether his honest assessment of human political calculations might compromise his neutral facilitation role. Princess Arya's luminous markings shifted to configurations that Thomas was learning to interpret as thoughtful concern, mixed with appreciation for candid analysis, rather than diplomatic evasion. You believe both sides include officials who are preparing for the negotiations to fail, because they view failure as more advantageous than success. I believe both sides include people who are more comfortable with familiar conflicts than with uncertain cooperation, even when cooperation might serve long-term interests more effectively than continued territorial competition. Thomas looked out at the impossible vista of Serenity Prime's landscape, where crystalline formations caught and reflected light in patterns that seemed to tell stories about possibility and hope. The question is whether those people have enough influence to create the failures they're prepared for. And your assessment of their influence. Thomas considered his response, aware that his evaluation of human political dynamics could either build trust with someone whose cooperation was essential for successful negotiations, or provide information that could be used to strategic advantage if their diplomatic relationship became more complex than professional facilitation. Significant enough to be dangerous if they coordinate their efforts, he said finally. Not significant enough to be inevitable if the people who genuinely want peace are willing to take some risks to outmaneuver those who profit from continued instability. What kind of risks? The kind that involve trusting people from the other species, despite having every historical reason to be suspicious. The kind that involve making decisions based on what could be possible, rather than what has always been true. Thomas found himself looking directly at Princess Arya, struck by the intelligence and dedication evident in her expression. The kind that people like you have been taking throughout these negotiations, working to find solutions that benefit everyone involved despite the political pressures that could make such solutions appear naive or dangerous to constituencies who prefer familiar hostilities to uncertain partnerships. The moment the words left his mouth, Thomas realized he'd shifted from professional assessment to personal appreciation, acknowledging Princess Arya's individual contributions rather than providing neutral analysis of diplomatic dynamics. Your dedication to these negotiations is really sweet, he continued, trying to clarify his meaning while aware that he might be making the personal dimension of his comments more obvious rather than less problematic. I mean admirable. The way you're working to find solutions that serve both our people's interests rather than advancing narrow factional concerns that could undermine whatever agreements we might reach. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Princess Arya froze completely, her luminous markings shifting to patterns that blazed with colors Thomas had never seen in his cultural briefings, while a blush seemed to emanate from her skin itself, creating patterns of warmth and light that made her look like she was glowing from within. "Say it again," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that Thomas's universal translator couldn't parse, but that conveyed depths of emotion and significance that made him realize he'd stepped into cultural territory his briefings had specifically warned him to avoid. "Your Highness, I think I may have used inappropriate terminology." "No," Princess Arya said, her voice stronger but still filled with wonder that made Thomas understand that whatever had just happened was considerably more significant than simple linguistic misstep. "Say the word again, please." Thomas looked at her transformed expression, at the patterns of light and color playing across her features, and realized that his casual appreciation for her diplomatic dedication had somehow triggered cultural mechanisms that his training had prepared him to prevent rather than navigate. "Sweet," he said quietly, watching as the words seemed to resonate through her entire being like a struck bell. Princess Arya's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they held depths of emotion that made Thomas understand that his honest admiration had activated something far beyond routine diplomatic interaction. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, his name carrying ceremonial weight that transformed their informal conversation into something that felt like formal declaration. "Do you understand what you have just initiated?" "I'm beginning to suspect that I've activated some sort of cultural protocol that my briefings didn't cover in sufficient detail," Thomas replied, aware that his next words would determine whether this situation became a diplomatic crisis or something else entirely. "The courtship echo," Princess Arya said, her voice carrying the kind of formal precision that suggested she was quoting from memory rather than explaining casual cultural concepts. "An ancient recognition that binds sincere expressions of personal admiration into provisional emotional and legal connections." As Thomas felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically, while garden systems around them began responding to Princess Arya's emotional state with harmonic resonances that indicated something with significant cultural implications. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "what exactly does the courtship echo require of us?" Princess Arya's smile was radiant enough to activate the garden's bioluminescent response systems. "It requires us to decide," she said, "whether the connection it has recognized between us is worth the political complications it will create, or whether it should be dissolved to preserve the diplomatic mission we're both here to serve." The activation of the courtship echo triggered immediate responses throughout the Crystal Reach's palace, with monitoring systems recognizing the unprecedented situation, while cultural advisors from both delegations attempted to determine whether the ancient Etherian bonding law represented a diplomatic opportunity or a crisis that could invalidate the entire peace process. "Let me understand this correctly," Ambassador Chen said during the emergency briefing that had been convened in a secure conference room, whose privacy systems ensured that their conversation remained confidential, while legal experts consulted databases about Etherian cultural law. "Our cultural liaison officer has activated an ancient Etherian bonding protocol that creates provisional consort status between him and their chief negotiator, potentially compromising the neutrality of our entire diplomatic mission." "That's an accurate summary of the immediate legal implications," Thomas replied, though he was acutely aware that the clinical description missed the emotional complexity of his situation with Princess Arya. "Though I should clarify that the courtship echo was triggered by my genuine appreciation for her dedication to the peace process, not by any intention to influence the diplomatic proceedings." Intentions aside, the courtship echo has created a situation where our supposedly neutral facilitator now has formal standing within the Etherian royal hierarchy, observed General Morrison, whose expression suggested he was calculating strategic implications rather than diplomatic complications. That connection could provide valuable intelligence about Etherian decision-making processes and negotiating strategies. It could also invalidate any agreements we reach if other parties claim that personal relationships have compromised the objectivity of the negotiation process, Dr. Kim pointed out, consulting cultural databases that painted the courtship echo as both a diplomatic opportunity and a potential disaster. The Etherians take emotional authenticity very seriously, but they also recognize that such authenticity can undermine the impartiality necessary for fair diplomatic resolution. Thomas looked around the briefing room at officials whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed calculation, understanding that his personal feelings about Princess Arya were now secondary to the political implications of their ancient bonding. "The courtship echo wasn't designed to serve strategic advantage," Thomas said firmly. "It recognizes authentic emotional connections that transcend political arrangements. Using the bond it creates for intelligence gathering would violate both Etherian cultural law and the genuine feelings that activated the echo in the first place." Before the briefing could continue down the path of exploitation versus ethical responsibility, Thomas's communication device chimed with an urgent message from Princess Arya. "Thomas, We need to meet privately. The courtship echo has revealed information that threatens both our missions, and time is running short to prevent those who profit from continued hostilities from eliminating the evidence of their coordination. The meeting took place in a secure chamber within the Etherian delegation quarters that Thomas's bonded status had granted him access to. A space whose crystalline architecture seemed to respond to their combined presence by creating enhanced privacy fields and security protocols that neither of them could have activated independently. What kind of information? Thomas asked immediately upon seeing Princess Arya's expression, which mixed urgency with barely controlled anger. The kind that reveals systematic sabotage of peace negotiations by officials from both our governments who have been coordinating their efforts to ensure that diplomatic initiatives fail while maintaining profitable instability. Princess Arya replied, activating holographic displays that showed intelligence data Thomas was certain he wasn't supposed to have clearance to see. The courtship echo grants access to protected communication networks that document coordination between war profiteers who benefit more from continued territorial disputes than from resolved boundaries. Thomas studied the displays, seeing evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of manipulation spanning both diplomatic hierarchies. The missing survey data, the gaps in economic documentation, the intelligence assessments that suggested continued negotiations were futile, all deliberately altered or suppressed by a conspiracy that includes General Morrison from your delegation and strategic advisor, Kethmorn from mine. Princess Arya finished, her markings shifting to patterns that Thomas was learning to interpret as controlled fury mixed with determined resolve. They profit more from arms sales and reconstruction contracts than from successful peace agreements that would reduce military expenditures and eliminate the crisis conditions that justify increased defense spending. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Communication logs showing coordination between supposedly opposing officials, financial records revealing shared investments in weapons manufacturing and private military contracting, and strategic analyses that had been deliberately skewed to make peaceful resolution appear impossible, while maintaining the profitable status quo of controlled territorial conflicts. They're not just sabotaging the negotiations, Thomas realized, understanding the scope of what they were facing. They're using the peace talks as cover for intelligence gathering and strategic positioning that serves private interests rather than legitimate governmental policy. Exactly. And the courtship echo gives us the legal standing and access necessary to expose their manipulation, while demonstrating that genuine commitment to peace exists despite their efforts to prevent it. Princess Arya moved closer, and Thomas noticed that the chamber's defensive systems were responding to their proximity by creating enhanced protective protocols. But exposing the conspiracy requires us to formalize the courtship echo through traditional ceremonies that would make our connection permanent and legally unassailable. And if we don't formalize the bond, then we lose the access that proves the conspiracy exists, while leaving ourselves vulnerable to elimination by people who view peace as bad for business and bonded witnesses as threats to profitable operations. Princess Arya's expression grew serious. The courtship echo protects those who serve authentic connection over political convenience, but only if they're willing to accept the full responsibility that such service requires. Thomas looked at the evidence that would either save or doom the peace negotiations, realizing that his honest appreciation for Princess Arya's dedication had created responsibilities that extended far beyond his original assignment as neutral cultural facilitator. "Your Highness," he said, understanding that his next words would determine not just their personal future, but the fate of negotiations that represented both species' best hope for lasting peace. If formalizing this bond means we can expose the forces working against genuine cooperation, while proving that personal connection strengthens rather than weakens diplomatic integrity. Then I'm willing to accept whatever responsibilities that requires. Princess Arya's smile was radiant enough to activate the chamber's bioluminescent response systems. Thomas, she said, his name carrying warmth that transcended formal protocol, I think that commitment to authentic partnership over political calculation is exactly what the courtship echo was designed to recognize and protect. As emergency alerts began activating throughout the palace, indicating that the conspiracy had realized their communications were being monitored and had decided to accelerate their timeline for destroying the peace process. Thomas realized that his simple appreciation for Princess Arya's sweetness had evolved into personal connection that would either expose the truth or make both of them permanent targets for elimination. So, he said, looking at the woman whose intelligence and dedication had made his professional neutrality impossible to maintain, shall we formalize this ancient bonding ritual while exposing a conspiracy and saving the peace process? I can't think of anything sweeter, Princess Arya replied, and the word echoed between them with the power to either reshape interspecies diplomacy or provide ammunition for those who preferred to maintain profitable divisions rather than build lasting partnerships. The conspiracy moved against them during the palace's night cycle when security protocols were operating with minimal staffing, launching coordinated attacks designed to eliminate both Thomas and Princess Arya before the courtship echo could be formally completed, and the evidence of systematic sabotage could be transmitted to oversight authorities throughout both civilizations. Multiple security breaches detected, announced the palace's artificial intelligence as emergency systems activated throughout the diplomatic facility. Armed personnel from both delegations are engaging in unauthorized activities that violate neutrality protocols governing the peace negotiations. Thomas and Princess Arya were in the process of preparing for the formal courtship echo ceremony when the assault began, surrounded by evidence that would either expose the war-profiteering conspiracy or remain suppressed if they were eliminated before the ancient bonding ritual could grant them permanent legal standing to prosecute the corruption. They're not waiting for us to complete the ceremony, Thomas observed, watching tactical displays that showed attacking forces moving through the palace with military precision while carrying weapons that violated diplomatic facility protocols. They've decided that preventing the courtship echo from being formalized is worth open violence against a neutral negotiation site, which means our choice is no longer whether to complete the bonding ritual, Princess Arya replied, activating defensive systems that Thomas hadn't known existed until their provisional bond granted him access to Etherian security protocols. Our choice is whether to formalize the courtship echo while under attack, or die separately while the war profiteers succeed in destroying the peace process and resuming profitable hostilities. The formal courtship echo ceremony was remarkably beautiful for a ritual conducted under siege, an exchange of vows that acknowledged their mutual admiration and commitment, while activating ancient systems that recognized bonds transcending political calculation. As explosions echoed through the palace and attacking forces fought their way through defensive barriers, Thomas and Princess Arya spoke the words that would bind their fates together permanently, while simultaneously broadcasting evidence of the conspiracy to governmental and military authorities across both star systems. I recognize in you the intelligence and dedication that makes lasting peace possible between our peoples, Thomas said, his voice carrying across communication networks that reached diplomatic oversight offices throughout human space, while armed confrontations continued around them. I accept the bond that protects what we share, and the responsibility to defend the hope you represent for genuine cooperation, rather than profitable conflict. I recognize in you the honesty and integrity that makes trust possible between species that have been taught to view each other with suspicion, Princess Arya replied, her words triggering security protocols that transformed their location into an impregnable sanctuary, while broadcast systems throughout the palace transmitted documented proof of the war-profiteering conspiracy. I accept the bond that unites our commitment to peace and the obligation to prove that authentic partnership serves both our peoples better than the artificial hostilities maintained by those who profit from our division. The moment their ceremony was complete, the palace's enhanced defensive systems activated with authority that neither the attacking human nor Etherian forces had anticipated, while emergency communication arrays transmitted evidence of systematic manipulation to news networks and governmental authorities across multiple star systems. "This is Admiral Santos of the Human Defense Fleet," came a transmission from loyal forces responding to the evidence broadcasts. "We have confirmation of the conspiracy allegations and are moving to arrest personnel involved in the unauthorized assault on the diplomatic facility." "This is High Commander Velnara of the Royal Guard," came a parallel response from Etherian military hierarchy. "The bonded negotiators are under our protection, and the treasonous elements within our delegation are being taken into custody for coordinating with foreign nationals to undermine legitimate peace initiatives." The peace negotiations that resumed under heavy security resulted in the most comprehensive cooperation agreements in the history of human-Etherian relations, with Thomas serving as cultural integration specialist and Princess Arya as chief negotiator, whose bonded partnership demonstrated that personal connection could strengthen rather than compromise diplomatic effectiveness. The territorial frameworks established in the new accords, Princess Arya announced during the formal treaty signing ceremony, reflect honest assessment of both species' needs rather than the manipulated information that has poisoned previous negotiations. Thomas's role as my bonded partner ensures that future cooperation will be based on authentic communication, rather than the strategic deception that has been exploiting our mutual suspicions for private profit. 6 months later, Thomas found himself reviewing reports from the joint cultural exchange programs while serving in his new role as Director of Interspecies Communication, working alongside Princess Arya to establish educational initiatives that taught both species to recognize and appreciate their fundamental compatibility, rather than focusing on the artificial differences that had been emphasized by those who profited from division. "The integration protocols are exceeding all projections," Princess Arya reported, her role as ambassador for cultural cooperation keeping her busy with programs that combined human and Etherian approaches to education, art, and social development in ways that neither species could have imagined working independently. "The courtship echo principles are being studied by diplomatic academies throughout both our territories as examples of how authentic personal connection can serve larger purposes rather than compromise them." The courtship echo principles that started with me accidentally calling your diplomatic dedication sweet during an evening conversation about the challenges of interspecies negotiation, Thomas replied, still amazed by the trajectory their simple appreciation had created. "Though I have to admit, serving as institutional advocate for authentic communication is considerably more complex than neutral cultural facilitation. More complex than you anticipated when you accepted diplomatic assignment. Much more complex, but also more meaningful than I knew was possible." Thomas looked out at the cultural center where human and Etherian students learned together, creating art and solving problems through approaches that combined both species' perspectives. "Besides, the company is exceptional." Princess Arya laughed, her luminous markings shifting to patterns that Thomas had learned to recognize as deep contentment mixed with boundless affection. "Even when the company includes a princess whose idea of romantic conversation involves reviewing cultural integration protocols and diplomatic effectiveness assessments. Especially then, Though I should probably mention that your tendency to activate ancient bonding laws during international negotiations is keeping our legal staff constantly busy updating relationship disclosure requirements for diplomatic personnel. That's what you get for bonding with someone whose cultural training emphasized authentic emotional expression over strategic calculation, Princess Arya said, taking his hand with the easy warmth that had grown from their shared survival and mutual commitment to serving principles larger than personal comfort. Besides, authentic appreciation seems to work well for us. Thomas looked around their shared office, where impossible partnerships between cultural facilitators and alien royalty were creating diplomatic innovations that served understanding rather than strategic advantage. You know, he said, squeezing her hand gently, when I called your dedication to peace sweet, the most complicated outcome I imagined was maybe having to apologize for using casual language during a formal diplomatic discussion. And instead, I discovered that honest appreciation for someone's character creates stronger foundations for lasting cooperation than all the careful strategic calculations that had previously governed interspecies relations. That ancient bonding laws recognize authentic connection more reliably than modern political frameworks, and that the most effective diplomacy happens when people choose to trust each other despite every historical reason to remain suspicious. More complex than routine cultural facilitation, much more complex than anything they covered in diplomatic training, but exactly as complex as it needed to be. Thomas brought her hand to his lips, noting how her markings shifted to configurations that told stories of joy and partnership. Some words are worth saying even when they activate ancient laws that transform your understanding of what service actually means. As they continued their work developing communication frameworks that served mutual understanding rather than competitive advantage, Thomas reflected on how dramatically his comprehension of diplomatic effectiveness had evolved. He'd started as someone who prevented cultural misunderstandings by maintaining careful emotional distance from all participants, and somehow become someone who proved that authentic personal connection created stronger foundations for lasting peace than the strategic deception that had previously characterized relations between species learning to trust each other. The work was more complex now, involving cultural integration programs that spanned star systems and educational initiatives that required constant attention to the difference between genuine cooperation and diplomatic theater that could be exploited by those who preferred profitable division to uncertain partnership. But the fundamental mission remained the same: ensure that communication served understanding rather than manipulation, and that authentic appreciation could be expressed safely between people who chose to see each other's worth despite artificial barriers maintained by those who profited from mutual suspicion. Thomas Mitchell had always believed that effective diplomatic facilitation required maintaining professional distance from the emotional implications of the relationships he helped others navigate. He just never imagined that the most important diplomatic breakthrough of his career would come from expressing honest appreciation for someone whose dedication deserved recognition, and that such appreciation could activate ancient laws that proved personal connection and institutional effectiveness were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of successful cooperation between peoples learning to build their future together. 3 months later, as Thomas watched the formal inauguration of the Interspecies Cultural Academy, with Princess Arya presiding as co-director, while he served as Chief of Communication Innovation, he marveled at how a simple word of appreciation had become the foundation for proving that authentic emotional expression created stronger diplomatic frameworks than all the careful strategic calculations that had previously governed relations between species who had forgotten how to trust each other. Any regrets about freezing, blushing, and asking me to say "sweet" again when you could have dismissed my comment as cultural misunderstanding? Thomas asked as they prepared for the ceremony that would mark the beginning of a new era in interspecies education. "Only that I didn't ask you to say it sooner," Princess Arya replied, her smile bright enough to activate the Academy's communication displays. "Though I should mention that your sweetness was evident long before either of us understood what recognizing it would mean for both our peoples. But sometimes the most important words are the ones spoken without calculation," Princess Arya said, her luminous markings telling stories of love and partnership that would inspire diplomatic innovation for generations. The courtship echo simply provided legal frameworks for connection that was already waiting to be acknowledged. As they walked together toward the inauguration ceremony that would mark the beginning of a new approach to interspecies relations, Thomas realized that his diplomatic service had evolved into something that protected not just individual negotiations, but the principle that authentic appreciation could be expressed safely between people who chose to recognize each other's worth despite every political reason to maintain suspicious distance. The most important cultural facilitation of his career had indeed involved preventing misunderstandings, not by avoiding emotional expression, but by proving that honest appreciation created opportunities for partnership that transcended the artificial barriers maintained by those who confused profitable hostility with legitimate caution. And sometimes, if he was very lucky, it involved sharing morning briefings with someone whose intelligence and dedication had made professional neutrality impossible to maintain, whose ancient laws had provided frameworks for turning personal appreciation into institutional transformation, and whose idea of celebrating their partnership included reviewing cultural integration success rates while planning new educational programs that would teach both their species that some words, like sweet, were worth saying even when they changed everything.